Hi, friends. Welcome back to Indistinct Chatter. I'm Eliza, and I hate to start off the show with a plug, especially for a multi-trillion-dollar company that also doesn't pay me. But I just found out that with Prime, we get a free book every month. Oh, it's called First Reads. It is digital, but I've been on a reading kick lately, so this is kind of fun, a free book. So basically, every month they release like a handful of free digital books to read. I don't have a Kindle though, and I already spend so much time looking at my phone screen. I just might have to start looking for a used Kindle to buy or something just for my free books. Because, like I said, it is very important to buy physical media, especially books. All right. But it's hard for me to turn down a free book. And yeah, I know Amazon doesn't need the plug. Love it or hate it. Amazon is what it is and whatever. Okay. I'm just a girl. Also, another fun plug. I have a very difficult relationship with sleep. I have a hard time falling asleep and often staying asleep. So most nights I'm up until like 3 a.m. and then I toss and turn and wake up off and on throughout the night. And then in the morning, I have a hard time waking up, obviously. But even if I wake up early, like let's say I fall asleep at 3, I get up at 5:30. So that's 2.5 hours. I'll still be up until 3 a.m. the next night. Like I still can't fall asleep. And I used to take sleeping pills every day, probably for almost a decade. But I stopped because apparently some of them are linked to higher chances of dementia and Alzheimer's. Don't quote me, but I don't want to increase my chances. I didn't really do a big deep dive. I got scared enough and I just quit cold turkey. But yeah, so I haven't taken sleeping pills in over a year. So yeah, so my plug is mahjong. I read, I say read lightly here. I read somewhere that playing mahjong can help you sleep. And I don't know if it's true or not. And I don't know if it's a placebo thing, but I've been playing mahjong on my phone for the last like week or two. And when I do play, I do fall asleep earlier. Like I'm falling asleep before 1 a.m. lately. And then if I skip a day of playing, it's back to not falling asleep till 3, waking up a bunch throughout the night. So now I kind of want to get a real mahjong set to play so I'm not staring at my phone screen more and see if that will help me even more. So if anyone else has experienced sleep improvements from playing mahjong, let me know. Anyway, that's not what today is about. So I saw a documentary on Hulu called My Grandfather Charles Manson. And with August 8th/9th being the anniversary of the Tate-LaBianca murders, I figured even with my weird relationship with true crime, I wanted to talk about this and also about Charles Manson. I know. Of course, I will be talking about violence, abuse, and murder. So if that is not your cup of tea, go ahead and skip this week. We will chat next week. Before I get started, does anyone else feel like a light knock on the door is very ominous? Is that a generational thing? Is that an anxiety thing or a paranoid thing or just a me thing? Because I got 2 packages delivered yesterday, and both times, whoever dropped it off knocked really lightly. And my dog doesn't usually bark or like acknowledge. I mean, he'll acknowledge if somebody knocks on the door. He'll kind of like perk up and maybe walk towards the door, but he doesn't like make a noise. But both times he did. And so I got a little nervous. And also, I mean, I think my senses were a little heightened because I was doing research for this episode. So I don't know, just all day and all night yesterday was a little spooky, just doing so much deep diving and like writing this episode. But I was just wondering if I'm alone with the door thing. I feel like it's a millennial thing. Maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, so I started with this documentary. It's starring and also co-directed by Sophia. Her dad, Dan, submitted his DNA to Ancestry because he's always been curious about his birth father. His mom obviously wouldn't tell him, and no one else would. And then he gets a match on Ancestry. He gets a message from Mike, who turns out to be his half-brother. So Dan, Sophia's dad, he's like, okay, great, a brother. So do you know who your dad is? And Mike tells him, It's Charles Manson. Imagine growing up not knowing who your dad is, and then you're seeing this man's face all over the magazines, all over the papers, and on every channel, basically on the news, literally everywhere. And you don't even know that that's your dad. And then what, like 30, 40 years later, you find out that man that you saw everywhere, that's your dad? That's got to be tough on the psyche. So Sophia is going through therapy and she's creating this documentary just to kind of break everything down with her own internal struggles and just, kind of addressing some questions like, are people born evil? Does evil get passed down through genetics? Will people see her differently? Does she have Charles evil in her? Like, it's a lot. And Sophia even speaks with some of the Manson girls. And the whole time I'm watching this documentary, I'm thinking, I've watched documentaries and listened to episodes and whatever about Charles Manson. And yet I feel like I don't actually know anything about him. But I wanted to know, like, what drew people in? And most importantly, what has continued to draw people in, especially after the murders and then, after he has died? Like, what is still drawing people to this man? How does he have this following? And that is what brought me to today's episode. And to be honest, to be vulnerable with you, this is kind of silly, kind of not silly. I always say that I am a susceptible person in terms of like having a higher chance at joining a cult. I mean, I did join an MLM back in the day, and not that long ago, I did apply to work on a ranch that I found out later was, maybe still is, run by a real cult. So I didn't know the exact science, if there was a real science or anything like that. But I always felt like I just had a higher chance of joining a cult. Put me back in the 60s and 70s. Absolutely. Anytime that I'm listening to a podcast or watching a documentary about a cult, they always sound amazing at first, at least, right? And I think that would have sucked me in because it's all about community. It's all about acceptance. It's all about freedom and blah, 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 blah. My saving grace, however, is that I have a hard time with authority. I don't follow authority blindly. I question things a lot. I am not someone who just does as I'm told without knowing the reason. But all that to say, I was still a little nervous doing a deep dive on Charles. I was kind of scared because I didn't want this to become an I Love Charles Manson episode. I didn't want this to make excuses for him. And honestly, I kind of wondered if I would start to feel drawn to him. I would feel that pull that everyone else, not everyone, but so many people have felt towards him. And I was a little scared of that. So let's find out, shall we? First, let's do what we do best here. Let's time travel. We're going back to 1934, November 12th. Charles was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, to Kathleen Maddox, who was 16 at the time. Kathleen actually didn't name Charles. The hospital records actually listed him as no name Maddox on his birth certificate. He got the name Charles later on, and Kathleen was married to William Manson for a while, so that's where Manson came from. Charles never actually knew his biological father, and William Manson dipped out before Charles was even old enough to remember him, but he still got his last name. There's a story you may or may not have heard. A waitress at a bar supposedly was joking around saying that she wanted a baby, and then Kathleen supposedly said, "Pitch her a beer and he's yours." And then she drank the beer and left, leaving baby Charles behind. And then apparently an uncle had to track Charles down days later. So this is a story that Charles told himself. He repeated this story quite a bit, but historians haven't found anyone to corroborate the story. And I realized just from the story alone that this is the first lesson to learn when researching Charles Manson, because honestly, his entire life was basically a manipulation. His stories constantly need to be fact-checked. He's not exactly a reliable narrator. But here is something we know for sure, according to court records. So when Charles was around 5 years old, Kathleen and her brother robbed a gas station. Reportedly, they used a ketchup bottle to like fake having a weapon. And then she went to prison for it. So Charles got shuffled off to relatives in West Virginia. And then when Kathleen was released, she and Charles bounced around a bunch more, different hotels, different states, different men. Then at just 9 years old, Charles got caught stealing. And by 12, he was sent to Jabot School for Boys in Indiana, which was, maybe still is, a reform school run by priests. He actually ran away from the school to get back to his mom, but according to multiple accounts, she did not want him. And if you think that's dark, it gets darker. So Charles spent just 4 days at Boys Town in Nebraska, which at the time was called Father Flanagan's Boys Home, before he ran away from there. He then stayed at the Indiana School for Boys, where he later said he was beaten and sexually abused. Records also show he became violent himself. And in the documentary, a representative from one of these schools even said it was very likely. There was a lot of abuse from adults as well as among the boys. And then at 17, at a federal reform school, Charles held a razor to another boy's throat and assaulted him. So yeah, not the best childhood, right? Pretty dark. And just a reminder, this isn't an I Love Charles episode. This isn't excusing him. I just kind of wanted to understand the pull. And then to understand the pull, you have to understand him, right? And understanding someone isn't the same as excusing them. I did see somebody on Reddit kind of explain it like this. Think of studying Charles, or, if you're studying true crime and you're looking into the perpetrator, think of it like studying a disease. So you're never rooting for the disease when you're studying it, right? You don't want the disease to come out on top. You're studying it so you can recognize it. And I think that's the only way, at least for me, to understand what this pull is, what this magnetization is of him. So I was like, I got to do some digging. So anyway, moving on. There's a 1951 prison evaluation that describes him as slick, but extremely sensitive and aggressively antisocial. And by the way, he's 16 here. So 16 in prison. Charles's first conviction was at just 13 years old. And by the time he was 32, he had spent roughly 17 years locked up. That's more than half his life. Charles even says he was raised by the institutions or the systems. I'm paraphrasing here. I don't remember his exact quote. But have you heard the name Dale Carnegie? How to Win Friends and Influence People? The same self-help course that Warren Buffett famously credits for changing his life? Well, prisons offered that as a class to inmates to help them adjust to the outside world, and Charles took the class. According to Jeff Gwynne, who wrote one of the definitive Manson biographies, Charles didn't just take the course. He studied it obsessively. Jeff even says that years later, almost every line Charles used to recruit people came nearly word for word out of that class and out of Dale Carnegie's material. He especially focused on Chapter 7, hyper fixated on Chapter 7. So what is Chapter 7? You want to know? Chapter 7 is all about let the other person feel that the idea is his or hers. Think about it. In 1969, the legal question at the center of the biggest murder trial in American history was basically, how do you convict a man who never touched the victims? Ooh, it sends chills down my spine. He spent years perfecting Chapter 7 as a skill to make his ideas feel like yours. Jeff also writes that Manson dabbled in Scientology while he was in prison. He picked it apart and chose to keep the parts of Scientology that were useful to manipulating people. Doesn't sound great. Also, in March of 1967, when he was released from Terminal Island Prison at 32, multiple accounts say he had asked the staff if he could just stay. And I mean, when you think about it, he'd spent more than half of his life in and out of prison. So outside, he was homeless. Inside, he had a home. But alas, the prison said no, so out into the California wild he went. Not the wild, but you know what I mean. And speaking of California in 1967, guess what else was happening? The summer of love, baby. San Francisco, tens of thousands of young people pouring into one neighborhood. I think it was called Haight-Ashbury. I should have double checked. Sorry, guys. But they were looking for meaning. They were looking for a community and enlightenment. And for some, honestly, they were just looking for a really good acid. It's the 60s. Jeff describes this all as a neighborhood overflowing with kids who didn't know where they were going or even what they were going to eat next. They had all come together searching for a guru. And according to Jeff, Charles preys on exactly those types of people, those youngsters. At this point, Charles is a 32-year-old ex-con. He's got a guitar, and under his belt, he also has a decade's worth of studying persuasion. He walks into this neighborhood full of teenagers actively looking for someone to follow, and just couldn't be more perfect. You know, right place, right time, just the really dark version of right place, right time. The stereotype of cults and cult leaders is that they collect weak, broken, gullible people, but that is just not true. I said that I would be very susceptible to cults, especially back in the heyday of cults. I am certainly not weak or broken or gullible, and research agrees with me, or I agree with the research. I don't know the proper way to say that. Margaret Singer, who studied the Manson case and was one of the leading psychologists on cults and coercion, found that about 2/3 of people who join cults are normally young people going through a period of personal crisis. So a breakup or a move, or maybe even not getting into the college you wanted. Basically, it's just a stretch of time where your ordinary structure of your life is out of sorts. It's off course. You know, the vibes aren't vibing right now for you. Researchers have found time and time again that intelligence doesn't protect you. Sorry, friends. I know you're all so smart, but you could still end up in a cult too. It's more so that timing is what matters most. So let's say you're in that period of your life where things are a little off track. An acquaintance or even a stranger approaches you and they introduce you to a group, and that group instantly welcomes you and you feel like you belong. It's that simple. It's how I joined an MLM. A woman approached me at a Walmart, complimented my hair. Then I think she complimented my skin, and then I joined an MLM. It's simple. And it happens just like that. And honestly, it's scarier than getting into a cult just because you're a gullible person, in my opinion. And maybe you think something bad has to be going on in your life for that to happen to you, but like nothing bad was going on for me. I just thought I was making a new friend, but it takes a lot less than you would think. Now, I want to play a little game. Let's see, based on the descriptions, if you can guess who would be more likely to join the family, as it was called, the Manson family. So do you think it was the woman who grew up going to Bible camp and she also worked as an insurance clerk? Or do you think it was the homecoming princess? Trick question, because both Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten were both Manson girls. And actually, most of the girls in the family were educated. They were also mostly from middle-class families. But the main thing that they had in common was that most of them were kids, literally teenagers, going through a transition in their life. They were in this era where it was just kind of like, I just want to drop everything familiar, you know? They just wanted something new. They wanted to change. They wanted freedom. They wanted community, whatever. They wanted something different. And Charles did what those Carnegie courses taught him. He figured out what each person wanted. He showed them he's the one who could provide it, but he let them feel like the idea was theirs. With most cults, there are tools the leader and recruiters use. Love bombing is a big one. At the time, there wasn't really a word for it. Basically, just, overwhelming amounts of affection and acceptance the moment you arrive. And this was one of Charles's tools. He also used LSD strategically. So according to almost every account, Charles dosed the group while he stayed sober. He was basically their trip master, trip sitter, whatever you call it. He would essentially just guide the trips for everyone. And, he's the sober one, so he's taking care of them. He's getting their trust. His other tool was giving everyone new names, which is much more sinister than just fun little nicknames. Susan Atkins became Sadie, for example. And when you think about it, your name is the oldest piece of your identity. It is literally you. And Charles would just replace it. Kind of reminds me of his name story. You know, he's an unnamed baby. He gets renamed by a stepdad who disappeared. Then he's in and out of institutions his whole life, probably getting different names, different numbers. Just interesting that he's now doing that to other people. He would then put everyone on a school bus, and he made the group everyone's whole world. You know, like they became a family. Then he takes that family, this new whole world for these people. You know, everyone in this family is everyone's entire world. And then he moves them into isolation. Spahn Ranch. Spahn Ranch was an old Western movie set just outside of LA. George Spahn, who was nearly blind at the time, he and his wife let the family live on the ranch for free in exchange for labor and, according to multiple accounts, sex from the young women. And on top of that, like I said, the ranch is isolated. So they're not getting any news. They're not hearing from their parents. There's no outside voices. It's just Charlie. So if you've been keeping track, we've got isolation, identity replacement, drugs, sex, and a message that sounds like freedom, but you have no outside voices, you have no way out. When you lay it out, it all sounds like red flags, but when you're in it, it doesn't, you know? And Charles knew how to make them feel like all of this was their idea. He was giving them this life of freedom. You know, I say that with air quotes here, freedom, and making them feel like this is what they wanted. This is what they worked towards. And so you might have noticed I've been using the term family, not cult. And that's, well, one, that's how everyone seems to refer to it. But also, Charles didn't think of himself as a cult leader. He actually thought of himself as something much less sinister. He thought of himself as a musician. And honestly, for a stretch there in 1968, the industry kind of let him feel that way. So in the spring of 1968, Dennis Wilson, the drummer of the Beach Boys, yes, the Beach Boys, Dennis picked up two young women hitchhiking in LA, but not just any two young women. They were part of the family. He gave them a ride, dropped them off, and then later they showed up at his house, and then Charles showed up, and then everyone else showed up. The whole Manson family basically just kind of moved into Dennis's place, and then they stayed there for months. He actually ended up moving out after reportedly spending a fortune on them, and then he just kind of like let the landlord handle the eviction. I think Dennis had some conflict avoidance issues. Before we leave Dennis's mansion, though, let me introduce you to Charles Watson. Charles grew up in Copeville, Texas, tiny town, and I mean tiny. Some people like to say, oh, I'm from a small town, and it's like 50,000 people. Get real. This is a true tiny town. It is unincorporated. I think when I looked it up, it said there were maybe 100 people who lived there. Don't quote me. His parents ran a gas station there, and he was, I mean, technically, by definition, a pillar of the community. He was church kid, youth group leader, honor roll student, athlete. He edited the school paper. Also, you'll notice his name is Charles as well. So I'll try to remember to say Watson, but he's going to get a nickname soon. So spoiler alert. Anyway, Watson goes off to college. He gets a little too into partying. He takes a visit out to LA and decides to drop out of college and move to California. There, he drifted into selling drugs. First, it was just weed, but eventually, by many accounts, some harder stuff. And he's doing this on the side while working as a wig salesman. Gig economy, baby. One day, he's cruising on Sunset Boulevard and he picks up a hitchhiker. Watson wrote a memoir, of course, and in it, he said something about how hitchhikers were very common on Sunset. The name Dennis meant nothing to him. And then the guy said he was one of the Beach Boys. Dennis! Oh, he's in 2 Manson hitchhiking stories. That's crazy. Small world. Watson takes Dennis home. Dennis invites him in. And then inside, there's a small man sitting on the floor with a guitar surrounded by young women. That was also something surprising to me. I don't know how I never noticed it. Looking at videos and pictures, I didn't realize that Charles was so small. Anyway, Watson later described the first thing he felt from Manson as, quote, a sort of gentleness and embracing kind of acceptance and love. Ding, 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 chapter 7 right there. We have this lonely transplant from Texas feeling an embracing kind of acceptance and love. Watson eventually gave the family everything he owned. He said he had spent years accumulating the right car and the right clothes to complete what felt missing inside him. And when he gave it all to Charlie, he suddenly felt very free. He moved to Spahn Ranch, where old George Spahn heard the accent and started calling him Tex. So that's where he gets his nickname. So it is said that Tex brought the hard drugs into the family, but what's documented is that he was dealing before he joined, that his drug activity ramped up during a stretch away from the ranch in Hollywood, and that by 1969, accounts describe heavy speed use around him and the ranch kind of as everything sort of just soured. So regardless of if he was the source or it was just the sign of the times, the ranch obviously got darker as the drugs got harder. And now we'll come back to Tex. We're not done with him yet. So back to Dennis first. Dennis believed in Manson's music. You can look it up. I get it. So Dennis recorded with Charlie. He introduced him around to other musicians and people in the industry, and the Beach Boys even recorded a Charles Manson song. He wrote a song called Cease to Exist. The band reworked it. They changed the lyrics, and then they even retitled it. So it's called Never Learn Not to Love. And they released it in December of 1968 as a B-side, and it later appeared on their album 2020. The songwriting credit went to Dennis Wilson and not to Charlie. Dennis later told Rolling Stone that Charlie didn't want the credit, just the money. Some accounts say Charlie was paid in cash and with a motorcycle. So regardless of payment and credit, you can probably imagine how Charlie felt when he heard his song, rewritten with someone else's name on it. Charles is a man who lives for an audience. You know, he's got a chip on his shoulder. He is owed an audience. Through Dennis, Charlie also met Terry Melcher. Terry was a big record producer who had worked with the Byrds, and he was also Doris Day's son. Charlie auditioned for Terry, but Terry passed. Terry lived with his girlfriend, actress Candice Bergen, in a rented house in Benedict Canyon at 10050 Cielo Drive. And Terry had taken Charlie to his house at least once. So Charlie knew the house. He knew where it was. He knew who lived inside it. And what do you think that house and those people represented to Charlie? This is a guy with a chip on his shoulder who thinks he's owed something. It represented the industry that told him no. Terry ended up moving out, and in early 1969, a new couple moved in, director Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate. I am going to try to keep this part short. Every retelling of this case spends its time in that house. And you know my weird relationship with true crime, but also I wanted this episode to focus more on the machine around Charles Manson. The victims weren't part of that machine. You know, they were just innocent people. And instead of re-victimizing and walking through their worst night, I am just going to tell you who they were. So Sharon Tate was 26, an Army colonel's daughter from Texas who became a rising star, warm and kind. She was 8.5 months pregnant with her first child at this time. Jay Sebring was a celebrity hairstylist and honestly a true pioneer. He basically invented men's hairstyling as an industry. Abigail Folger was an heiress to the Folger coffee fortune who spent her time doing social work and volunteering. Now, this next person, he's from Poland. He has a Polish name, so I am very sorry if I mess this up. Wojciech Frykowski was a writer. He was also Abigail's boyfriend, and he was a friend of the Polanskis from Poland. Stephen Parent was an 18-year-old El Monte kid working 2 jobs who knew the property's caretaker. Stephen had actually picked up the property's caretaker hitchhiking, gave him a ride home, and then the caretaker told Stephen to stop by any time. So Stephen had stopped by on this fateful night to try to sell the caregiver a clock radio that he had refurbished himself. The next night, Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, a grocer, and his wife were killed in their own home across the city. The family's violence didn't end or even start there. Gary Hinman, a music teacher, had been murdered weeks earlier in July, and a ranch hand and stuntman named Donald Shorty Shea was murdered that August as well. So Charlie was convicted for these deaths without personally carrying out the Cielo Drive killings. He sent these people, these same people he'd spent 2-ish years renaming, isolating, and dosing. The person who did most of the actual killing on both nights was Tex Watson, the honor student, the church kid, the small town good boy. According to trial testimony, when he entered the Cielo Drive house, he announced, quote, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." And Tex is also tangled into the question of why any of this happened in the first place. So 5 weeks before the murders, on Manson's instruction to find money, Tex set up a fake drug deal and burned a dealer named Bernard Lotsapapa Crow out of $2,500. Lotsapapa allegedly called Spahn Ranch and threatened to come and kill everyone there. So Manson went to Lotsapapa and shot him in the stomach. He survived, but Charlie reportedly believed for a while that he had killed him. He also wrongly believed that Lotsapapa was a Black Panther, and that fed into his paranoia that a retaliation was coming. According to accounts of the case, the pistol Charlie used on Lotsapapa was also the same gun that Tex carried into the Cielo Drive residence 5 weeks later. Also, just a crazy turn of events, Lotsapapa and Tex reportedly ran into each other in prison in the early 80s. They talked it out, and Lotsapapa forgave Tex. Just interesting, weird. So why that house? Well, prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi argued at trial that Manson was trying to ignite Helter Skelter, an apocalyptic race war he preached about, named after a Beatles song, after which he believed he and the family would come out on top. That's the version history mostly remembers, partly because Vincent's book about it became the best-selling true crime book ever, but it has always had doubters. Time magazine and others have reported the theory that the Cielo Drive address was chosen to send a message to Terry Melcher in the industry that rejected him, since Manson knew Terry no longer lived there, but knew what that house meant. Other researchers over the years have argued drug deals gone wrong were tangled up in all of it, pointing to things like the Lotsapapa shooting and the fear it put into the ranch that summer. And journalist Tom O'Neill spent 20 years documenting holes in the official narrative in his book, Chaos. So whatever version is true, they all come back to the same endgame. A man who believed the world owed him something, and followers trained to treat his ideas as their own. So that's it, right? The spell is broken. Manson goes to prison forever. Everyone breaks free of him. They never look back. Right? Right? Wrong. The murders didn't end the poll. The murders made the poll national. The trial in 1970 and 1971 was, for lack of better words, a circus, Charlie being the ringmaster. This is where he carved an X into his forehead, later turning it into a swastika, and some of his followers carved X's into their foreheads to match him. Family members camped outside the courthouse, and it was just nuts. Cameras couldn't look away, obviously. It was a total media frenzy. And that's honestly very much, in my opinion, by design. There was something I read on history.com about Charlie's grip on America. It said Charlie was determined to be important. If he couldn't get it through fans or followers, he would take it in any form he could. Think about it. He was always rejected. His face now is everywhere. His eyes, his hair, his stare. The human embodiment of evil printed all over every magazine cover. He's getting interviewed. People are talking to him. This is everything he wants. Charles was sentenced to death in 1971. Then the next year, in 1972, California briefly struck down the death penalty, moving his sentence to life in prison. In a sense, Charles was back home for the next 46 years. Okay, the end, right? Now, you've probably heard that Charlie received more mail than any other prisoner in the American prison system. I couldn't find definitive proof on this, so for now, we'll just say that's prison folklore. But it is true that he received huge volumes of letters and visit requests for nearly 5 decades. These are people who wrote to him for over 18 years, and some of them even published their correspondences. A man in Mississippi kept up a pen pal and phone relationship with him for 7 years. Strangers would confess their sins to him like he was this priest or something, I don't know. And as for the original family members, some of them also never let go. Lynette Squeaky Fromme, who was part of his inner circle, was interviewed decades later in her 70s after Manson had been dead for some time. And she said that she was still in love with him. Also, side note, she had gone to prison herself for pointing a gun at President Ford. Just interesting. Charles even had an ideology to keep people interested and connected. ATWA, which stands for Air, Trees, Water, Animals. Manson environmentalism, basically. And versions of it still float around online today, kept alive by devotees, because, attaching your brand to saving the earth is a very effective way to make devotion feel noble. In 2007, a 17-year-old girl in a tiny town in Illinois named Afton started writing to Charles Manson. At 19, she took her savings, about $2,000. She left home and she moved to Corcoran, California for one reason and one reason only: to be near Charlie's prison. She actually visited him twice a week for years. And much like the other Manson girls, he renamed Afton. She was renamed Star. She shaved her head and she carved an X into her forehead. Also, just like some of the trial era girls that did that 40-something years before her. She ran websites arguing he was innocent. And then in November 2014, Charlie, at age 80, and Star, at age 26, got a marriage license. She told the AP part of the appeal of marrying him was that next of kin gets access to information and documents nobody else can touch. I don't know. To me, that seems like an odd reason to want to marry someone. But that's just me. According to journalist Daniel Simone, Starr and a friend planned to obtain Manson's body after his death and display it in a glass crypt as a paid tourist attraction. Apparently, this didn't sit right, so the wedding was called off. And I don't know if this is verified truth. This claim comes from one author promoting a book and was never really confirmed. Plus, Starr denied the wedding was off at the time. But either way, the license did expire without a wedding. So there's that. It's just kind of interesting. The line between worshiping him and monetizing him just seems to get blurrier and blurrier with people. And back to Tex Watson. So the man whose hands actually did the slaughtering. He's 80-ish, and he's still in prison. He's been denied parole 18 times, most recently in 2021 with a 5-year denial. So maybe he'll try again this October. He also has his own magnetic pull, even from prison. So in 1979, a woman named Kristen, who started writing to him after reading his memoir, married him in a prison ceremony. Through conjugal visits, before California banned them for lifers in 1996, they had 4 children. 4 children, fathered from inside prison by the man who murdered a woman 2 weeks from giving birth. And I'm not going to get into it. Like I said, I don't want to talk about the murder that much. You can look it up. But I will say she was brutally murdered. And while I was doing some digging, I learned some new facts that I didn't know before, and they were really hard to read. Her death was not quick. There was no mercy. So it's just interesting that he gets to be a dad. I don't know. In 1981, he became an ordained minister, and he founded a prison ministry called Abounding Love, and he has spent 4 decades framing his story as Christian redemption. I don't know how well it's going for him. I mean, he's been denied parole 18 times, so I don't know if the redemption's working. Doris Tate, Sharon's mom, spent about a decade after her daughter's murder buried in grief, and what pulled her out was rage with a purpose. So in the early 80s, she learned that Leslie Van Houten had collected 900 signatures supporting her parole. Leslie did not participate in Sharon's murder, but she took part in the killings at the LaBianca home the following night. She actually held down Rosemary LaBianca while others stabbed her, and then she admitted later that she stabbed the victim 14 to 16 times after being told to do something to ensure everyone got their hands dirty. So yeah, Leslie collected 900 signatures to support her parole, and Doris went out and collected 350,000 signatures against it. Doris also backed a citizens group opposing Texas parole, whose petitions grew to more than 2 million signatures over the years, and she did this with her daughters, Patty and Deborah. But that's not all. Doris became a driving force behind California's Victims' Bill of Rights in 1982, which created the right for victims and their families to speak at sentencing and parole hearings. And in 1984, at a parole hearing for Tex Watson, Doris Tate stood up and delivered what is considered the first victim impact statement in California history. She looked at the man who killed her daughter and asked, quote, "What mercy, sir, did you show my daughter when she was begging for her life?" Chills. It's chills. Today, every single state allows some form of victim impact statement, and that's largely in part to Doris and her daughters, Patty and Deborah. They still carried that work and that mission forward to this day. Now, I don't know how Charles would have felt about all of this, but it's kind of interesting to me, maybe kind of ironic, the legacy aspect of all of this. The most concrete legal legacy of the Manson murders is that victims' families in America got a voice because one mother refused to let her daughter be reduced to a crime scene. Sharon Tate's name is on victims' rights foundations, while Manson's name is on merchandise. So 2 very different legacies. Charles Manson died on November 19th, 2017. He was 83 years old, and I have kind of a fun story. Fun's not the right word, and it's not about his death. Just kind of an interesting story of where I was. I was at a house party, and that's not the interesting or fun part. At this party, for reasons I will never understand, the host was recording a podcast episode during a house party. There were so many of us, such loud music. And then like 7 or more of us, I don't remember how many, we all piled into this little room and we sat around a phone talking over each other. So no microphone, no plan, nothing. And I had actually mentioned Manson's death because I think we heard about it on the radio on the way to the party. And just mentioning it was not received very well. It was received very weirdly. I don't know if the episode was ever posted. I doubt it. I can't imagine that you could hear anything intelligent on that episode. But that was the first time that I was like, oh, hey, maybe podcasting could be something I'd like to try someday. I mean, it took almost a decade later, but I'm here. And crazy enough, I'm talking about Charles Manson. It's crazy. Life's crazy. Anyway, so Charles dies. Surely it's all done now, right? Right? Think again. The pull, the fascination, the obsession, it does not end. I'm going to tell you about one of the strangest court battles I've ever read about, and it's about his body. So at least 3 parties came forward after Charles died. Jason Freeman, a former MMA fighter from Florida who said he was Manson's grandson, through Charles Manson Jr., a son who had changed his own name to escape the association and then later died by suicide in 1993. Michael Brunner, whose mother was family member Mary Brunner, raised by his grandparents, also Manson's biological son, as according to Ancestry. He's the half-brother to Daniel, Sophia's dad from the documentary. And then Michael Channels, a pen pal who had become a collector and seller of Manson memorabilia and also had shown up with a 2002 will naming himself sole beneficiary. Those are the 3 guys that showed up for his body. Meanwhile, per Reuters and the AP, his body sat in Bakersfield morgue for about 4 months, and the county went to court partly because the coroner literally just needed the space. Then in March 2018, the court ruled for Jason Freeman, and he had Manson cremated and scattered after a small private funeral. But interestingly, according to a legal research summary of the estate case, a DNA test on Freeman came back negative, and court papers showed Manson denied being related to him. So just interesting that the court ruled in favor of him then. The estate itself, the music royalties and the image rights and just all of it were dragged on separately in an LA court. And just like, it's a whole thing. But 50 years later, Manson, or the idea of Manson, whatever, is still surrounded by people whose stories can't quite be verified. He himself, being an unreliable narrator, he built this story, this world, this life of unreliable narrators, and they all outlived him. So the obsession is still very strong and still very much pulling to him. And then, because we're not done yet, there's the whole like travel and road tripping aspect of all of it, this industry, because people don't just read about this man, they travel for him. So the house at 10050 Cielo Drive was demolished in 1994. The new owners built a different house and they even changed the address, but people still go. Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails, who lived in the original house and recorded the downward spiral there before it came out, took the front door with him when he left, and bricks from the fireplace still turn up on eBay. Bricks. It's insane. From a murder house. Spahn Ranch sits inside a state historic park now, and it's one of the best known dark tourism spots in California, with trails to the old ranch site. And right now, in 2026, there's a company in Hollywood that will drive you to the Manson sites in an authentic funeral limousine. And their website tells you to book 2 to 4 weeks ahead of time because the Manson tour sells out. Sells out 57 years later. A murder tour. It's crazy. And Hollywood can't let it go either. Tarantino built Once Upon a Time in Hollywood around the case. Mary Harron, the director of American Psycho, she made Charlie Says in 2018. I do recommend that one, though, because it does what almost no Manson movie does. It barely cares about Manson at all. Instead, it follows the Manson girls in prison years later. There's a grad student. She's basically cracking the spell held over these women. They have classes or something. I don't remember for sure. I haven't seen it in quite a while. And then the screenwriter for Charlie Says, Guinevere Turner, she grew up in a cult herself. And then there's the movie Manson Family Vacation. Last I looked, this was still at 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. I don't know how many reviews it received or where it's at, but last time I looked, it was at 100%. It's a fictional indie film. It's from 2015. It's about these two brothers. One's a straight-laced lawyer and the other's more of a drifter. And then the drifter brother shows up at the lawyer brother's house. He wants to go tour the Manson murder sites. And the lawyer brother's like, weird, but then he eventually gives in. The movie, though, is really about the drifter brother. You know, he's this lonely guy. He was adopted and he latched on to the family, the Manson family, because the word family was right there in the name. And it just goes to show that that same hole that Manson found in those kids in San Francisco in 1967 is the same hole that this dark tourism and Manson forums and true crime content, and yes, sometimes podcasts, are still feeding into or whatever. You know, he found these kids going through something, going through a transition period, and I think a lot of people who resonate with Manson have a lot of those same qualities. They're going through something, they're missing something, and I think that's the pull. That's where the obsession begins. Now back to the documentary, My Grandfather Charles Manson. Some of it was hard to watch, honestly. I mean, you learn more about the murders, obviously, and you learn some pretty horrible, sad things about Charles's history growing up, but also Sophia and her dad, they fight in this documentary, and the things that get said are really sad. They're pretty horrible. And I don't know if I could forgive those things, to be honest. And then while you're watching them just kind of like tear into each other, you realize that you're watching this inheritance in real time. So Sophia's dad grew up not knowing who his father was. He was seeing this face everywhere, on the news, magazines, blah, blah, blah. And then he finds out the truth decades later. And he carried that with no roadmap, no tools, no resources. He just had to kind of like, I guess, just like take it and deal with it. But he wasn't given those tools to deal with it. And then Sophia makes a point in the documentary that I thought was really interesting. It's kind of like a dumb moment, but it's also very insightful. So for Charles and for Sophia's dad, Daniel, like I said, they didn't have the resources, so there was no help for their mental health. There was no support for what they were struggling with. They at least didn't get the tools they needed. And then thinking of that with everything I read, it really paints a new light, not an excuse, just more of an understanding of how we got here. The system had Charles Manson in its custody for most of his childhood and half of his adult life. He was evaluated over and over. Remember, at 16, someone wrote him up as extremely sensitive and aggressively antisocial. He was punished, then transferred, then punished, then transferred over and over again. He had no control of his life. He never got his way. He wanted out, but then he'd be brought back. Then he wanted to stay, and then he got kicked out. His mom didn't want him. The system didn't want him. Nobody wanted him. Then finally, he takes a class that really sticks with him. And of course, it's a persuasion course. And now he's finally getting to learn how to get your way. He's got that chip on his shoulder and he's taking a course that feeds it. So I feel like the documentary asks a what if that I found more insightful and interesting than the usual what ifs. That movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that asks a what if, but the what if is more of a fantasy of like, what if that night went differently? And it's like a revenge fantasy where the horror is like put back onto the bad guys, like the bad guys die, happy ending for everyone else. It's a fantasy. Life's not a fantasy. So for me, the documentary doesn't necessarily ask what if his childhood was different. It's more so asking, like, what if he had gotten help, actual help for whatever was going on in his head at any point of his life? Would things have been different? And that being said, I want to remind you, this is not an I Love Charles Manson episode. I am not a Charles apologist, okay? Untreated mental health struggles do not make people into Charles Manson or cult leaders or murderers. The overwhelming majority of people carrying trauma and getting zero support never hurt anyone. And plenty of the people he destroyed were carrying their own traumas and their own hurts, and they didn't do anything, The question in the documentary didn't take blame off of him at all, or off the family members who tortured and murdered actual human beings. Tex Watson had this loving childhood that Manson never got, and he's the one who did the killing. So, no, resources are not an excuse, but would help have changed anything is still a question worth asking. In my opinion, I think that's how we learn. I think that's how we see red flags, and that's how we prevent the same thing happening. And for Sophia, I never realized how many kinds of grief one person can carry at the same time. So she doesn't have the relationship with her parents that she seems to need. She has a grandfather who she never met. He's dead. He's not around to get questions answered from. He's also Charles Manson, so that's a thing all on its own. And then on top of all of that, with her own family and her lineage, you can see her carrying grief for the people her grandfather's family took. Obviously, she didn't do it. Her dad didn't do it, but both of them still inherit this weight of what happened and internalize it as grief and guilt and just heavy stuff. And this documentary shows you that the harm never stopped at the people the family killed. It moved through everyone he touched physically and emotionally, and it's still moving 2 generations later through people who weren't even alive back then. And as you're watching this and learning about him, you do have these brief moments where you do feel bad for Charles, even when you're doing some research and you're reading about his past. But the documentary doesn't apologize for him or excuse him. It still dives into the awful, awful things he did, and it still holds him accountable. But when you're learning these things, you do get pulled in with sympathy, and then with horror, and then with curiosity, and then with guilt about the curiosity. It's a whole thing. Something interesting, though, while doing this research, I realized that almost everything about Charles was borrowed or stolen. The Carnegie techniques, the Scientology pieces, even naming something after a Beatles album. Like, even his song got taken and renamed. The one thing Charles Manson genuinely made himself is the obsession. You could say, by me doing this episode, that technically I was kind of under his spell because that's part of the obsession for people, but luckily I always have at least a hand or a foot out of the rabbit hole when I'm going in. Otherwise, this could have gotten real spooky real fast. I just think the best thing that we can do for now is to focus on the future and the present, not constantly focusing on the past and the what ifs, and instead using the what ifs to prevent something like this happening again in the future. And I know that that is kind of just like an I just want world peace type of wish, but it's a wish worth wishing, in my opinion. And that, my friends, after all the rambling and nonsense, that's all I have for you today. If you have an I almost joined a cult story, or if you were in a cult, please send me a DM. Or if you know somebody who is in a cult, send me a DM. You can find the show on Instagram at indistinct.pod or me at Eliza Hollister. Feel free to also provide any feedback, any topic suggestions, reading material, movies, documentaries, whatever it is, send it my way. Also, please, if you haven't already, please subscribe, rate, review, all that fun stuff. It helps so much, and I appreciate it a lot, a lot, a lot. We will chat next week. Love ya. Love you. Bye.